How did the conflict in Syria start? When did it first start? What are the factors that are involved with it?
That's an impossible question. Syria, as it exists today, was created as a French colony in the 1921, but the French adjusted the borders then later in the 20s. But in doing so, they included a number of different groups, a number of different communities that had always been in conflict, as was done in many of the Middle Eastern nations. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the British and French drew the borders in the Middle East in a way that didn't make a lot of sense. Syria was created, including, let's see, two major groups and a number of smaller ones. The major groups are the Arab Sunnis, who are the majority, the Alawites, who dominate the northwest, the coastal area between Turkey and Lebanon. Now the Alawites are strange. Alawite doctrine keeps their official beliefs secret. They're generally associated with the Shiites, with Arab Shiites. So you have a conflict from the creation of Syria between the majority Arab Sunnis and the minority Alawites. There are other groups, Christians in some of the cities, Druze in the western countryside, Kurdish, Sunnis in the northeast. And there had been Jews before the creation of Israel. But the main conflict is between the Alawites and the Sunnis. Since the Assad family came to power in the 1960s, the Alawites have been dominant. In order to keep that control, the Assad family has moved their Alawite co-religionists into positions of power in the government and in the military. Arab Sunnis have felt for a long time that they are being held down. So the main conflict today is between the Arab Sunnis, who feel like an oppressed majority, and the Alawites, who are afraid that if they lose control, the Sunnis will oppress them. Now, the Sunni opposition to the Assad government has itself divided between the Free Syrian Army, which is getting a lot of support from the Saudi Arabians, the Gulf states, the Qataris, and who then it can be assumed will follow generally Saudi religious policy, introducing the very strict, very puritanical Wahhabi form of Islam. But in Syria, they have to be considered the moderates, because the other faction, the other Sunni faction, the al-Nusra Front, is more extreme. Qutbis want to see other moderate Arabian governments, other moderate Muslim governments overthrown, introduce very strict Sharia law, introduce a government that would be somewhat similar to the Taliban of Afghanistan. The al-Nusra Front, this more extreme faction, has been gaining power because they're getting money and equipment from al-Qaeda in Iraq. So those are the main factions. You can divide it three ways. The Assad government, supported by the Alawites, the Sunni Free Syrian Army, supported by Saudi Arabia, and the al-Nusra Front, supported by al-Qaeda. Those are the factions in Syria. Now, what makes this conflict go on longer is that each of the factions in Syria is being supported by outsiders. The Assad government is being supported by Iran. Iran has tried to form sort of a Shiite bloc, stretching from Iran, which is Shiite, western Afghanistan, which has strong Shiite populations, then into southern Iraq, which is Shiite, Syria, which has been dominated by the pro-Shiite Alawites, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. If Syria were to be dominated by a Sunni government, that Iranian sphere of strength would be gone. So the Iranians have been supporting Assad's government. They've been providing money, they've been providing weapons, and they've been providing soldiers. Some of the elite Al-Quds soldiers from Iran have been crossing into Syria and fighting. And of course, beyond that, Syria is getting some support from the Russian government, although they have to pay for most of that. And in the UN, some protection from the Chinese. Now, on the other side, the Free Syrian Army is being supported with weapons and money by the Saudi Arabians, and probably some fighters as well. And now our government, President Obama's administration, has decided to begin providing some support to the Free Syrian Army. Finally, the al-Nusra Front, the extremist Sunnis, are being supported by al-Qaeda, with men, with soldiers, with money and equipment and weapons. So this isn't just a fight in Syria. It's a battleground for Iran to fight Saudi Arabia. Does that answer your question? It was a fairly long answer.
It does. It was really enlightening. So what sort? You talked about sort of who's supporting who in the conflict. So with this conflict that's still going on, how has this affected the Middle East, and how has it affected relationships with all the other countries? How has it affected relationships with the U.S., and how has it affected Israel?
That's a wide variety of different questions. It may take up the rest of our time. There are a lot of conflicts in the Middle East that have been buried. Conflicts between Shiite and Sunni, between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. Those have existed for a long time. They've been kept buried, kept in the background. Now they've been given a place to actually be fought out with bullets and with blood. So all of those conflicts that have existed are coming out in Syria. Syria is not just a Syrian civil war. It's all of the Mideast conflicts at once. It's a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. The Israelis are taking in what, in my opinion, is a somewhat unfortunate position, a certain amount of schadenfreude, watching the people, all of whom say they hate Israel, fight it out. Israel's enemies are fighting each other in Syria, and the Israelis are taking an unfortunate amount of enjoyment in it. Hezbollah, on the side of the Assad government, has tried to distract by drawing Israel into it. Hezbollah has taken over some of the Syrian border positions on the Golan Heights. They have threatened to fire missiles and mortars into Israel, tried to draw Israel in, because if Israel's drawn in, it might distract people from the Assad government's crimes in Syria. But Israel has, for the most part, stayed out. The United States would rather stay out of this as well. We've had the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's not a whole lot of stomach in the United States for getting involved inside of another Middle Eastern state. But at the same time, the U.S. has functioned for some time as a world hegemon. The hegemon is a nation that sets rules to govern international relations. And one of the rules we set was no use of chemical weapons. And when it appears the Assad government used chemical weapons against the Free Syrian Army in the suburbs of Damascus, and I have to add that that's assumed, it's not been proven. But if it were proven, the U.S. would have quite a bit of pressure to go ahead and enforce the rules we've set. And these are good rules. And the idea that no one uses chemical weapons is a good one. A lot of people died when the Assad government or someone else used chemical weapons in Damascus. So there is a good reason for us to enforce that rule. We don't have a whole lot of stomach to do it. There's another level to this. As I said, the U.S. has functioned as a world hegemon since the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91. There are a lot of nations who'd like to see that break down. There are a lot of nations who prefer a system of regional hegemons. Russia would like to set the rules for its neighbors. China would like to set the rules for its neighbors, and so on. And the Russians, therefore, have an interest in breaking down the U.S. position as world hegemon. They see our position as setting rules, as limiting what they can do to their neighbors. So they don't want to see the U.S. enforce those rules. And so you get not just the Syrian conflict and not just the regional proxy conflict inside Syria, but the struggle over the difference between a world hegemony and regional hegemons. And that's then motivated much of Russian and Chinese decision-making. They don't want to see the rules, they don't want to see the rules enforced in Syria because the U.S. set those rules. They don't want the U.S. setting rules for what China can do in Taiwan, what Russia can do in Georgia, and they'd like to see that broken down.
All right, we'll go for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So how would you hold the Syrian government accountable if, in fact, they did use chemical weapons in Syria?
The proposal that's almost accidentally developed to see Syria's chemical weapons removed, that's great. That enforces the rule that if you use your chemical weapons, those chemical weapons are removed from you. I think that that would go a long way towards deterring other nations from using chemical weapons, which is what we want. So if that can be done, that is a wonderful solution. It's almost accidental, but it'd be great. No one has to bomb anybody. No one uses further chemical weapons. It allows the Syrian conflict to go on. But no one says that there's a rule against civil wars. So that would be the best solution, to see the chemical weapons removed. If that doesn't work, then cruise missile strikes on Syrian Air Force bases would be the next best solution. Attack the Syrian military. Punish Assad for the use of chemical weapons. That, of course, depends on proving that Assad did actually use the chemical weapons. If they were used by someone else, it's much harder to punish guerrillas or terrorists. But if you can show that the Assad government used them, and you then remove his chemical weapons, you have a solution.
All right. Now this is sort of a 2-part question, but what does the future look like for Syria? What are some possible outcomes if Assad wins versus the other factions that are fighting him?
It's hard at this point to see a good outcome for Syria. If the Assad government wins, then he will punish his opponents harshly. When his father was threatened, they killed something like 100,000 people in Homs. You could expect similar sort of punishment on top of the 100,000 more plus that have died in this conflict. You could take it further. A victory by the al-Nusra Front could see a Taliban government, Taliban-style government in Syria. Syria's got a larger population than Afghanistan. It means more people falling under a Taliban-style government with all of its harshness for women. The Free Syrian government, the Free Syrian Army, and the Syrian National Council, if they win, it's hard to tell exactly who they are. The Free Syrian Council is composed of many different groups. You could see something along the lines of the Saudi Arabian government, which is harsh, not to my taste, but not as harsh as, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan. And punishment on the Alawites. That might be the best outcome, a free Syrian government that could evolve towards something less harsh. The worst possible outcome, and we haven't discussed this, is a broadening of the war. The Kurdish faction, the Kurdish ethnic group in northeastern Syria spreads out across into Iraq, where they already have an autonomous government, but also into southeastern Turkey. The Turks are desperately afraid of another Kurdish uprising, like the one they had in the 70s and early 80s. The Turks might decide to move into northeastern Syria to stop a Kurdish uprising. It's unlikely because the Turkish civil government is afraid of the Turkish army, but it's a possibility. Lebanon in many ways is a microcosm of Syria, with almost equal division between Sunnis, Shiites, and Christians. Lebanon has gone through disastrous civil wars, but it's easy to see how this civil war in Syria could become another civil war in Lebanon. And of course, someone might decide to draw the Israelis in. All of those could mean a broader war with even higher casualties. It's hard to see a good outcome in Syria, but that's where we're at.